So a theme that's been on my mind of late, and it's something that I'm going to actually explore more, probably in a PowerPoint, is this idea of agency and freedom. And the title of this video, at least the intended title, is "The God Who Makes Us Free." And so when it comes to talking about freedom, it's a pretty loaded word, and people use it differently in different ways. And I think everyone claims to want freedom. But what freedom actually means is subject of debate, and there are many different viewpoints. And so, kind of what this video is to offer kind of my insight into what it means to be free and what it means to be free in a gospel context, and guess why that matters. Um, so, when it comes to freedom, there are two thoughts that have kind of, or two there is one way of conceptualizing or categorizing freedom, which is negative freedom and positive freedom. And these are usually used as a framework to kind of help wrap our minds around what it means to be free. And in that framework, there's negative freedom doesn't necessarily mean bad freedom. It just means freedom from something, right? So it's usually, it can be also associated with liberty, where we are free from constraints. Whereas positive freedom is this idea of self determination, that you're free to choose your life in the course of your life. And so what ends up happening though is that these two categories of freedom often get placed on opposite ends, that they're in contradiction to each other. And I don't think that's necessarily the right view of things. I think, especially in a context of the gospel and what God's doing with us, uh, it requires both a negative freedom, and it promotes a positive freedom. And so let me kind of explain why. So one of the key things to understand about becoming like God is choosing to be like Him, and that comes from successive experiences of discerning between good and evil and choosing the good. And the good is what is valuable, and the good is what God value. The good is God possesses the good as well. God possesses every valuable thing, everything that is worthwhile, that is worth holding on to. God possesses, and our job in becoming like God is to adopt that same mindset of finding whatever is valuable and adhering to that. And so, given that we're looking and we are needing to find what's valuable, in order to do so, we need to have freedom to make those choices. And so, this is where freedom from restraint is applicable, because we need to be free to, in a sense, make our own choices. Now, I'm not saying completely free and there's no consequences or whatever. Obviously, I mean, there needs to be some level of restriction on that. You can't just be free to kill whoever you want or to do whatever you want to someone's property or to just break into someone's house. I mean, obviously, there's limits, and I want to be clear on that. But there still is a freedom of being able to be unrestrained in the choices we make, and given some space to make those mistakes, right? And that's where the Constitution and the American, at least early founding American government, this idea of limited government, decentralized government, basically the government there to protect your rights so that you could then be free to pursue your course of life. And that's kind of how what really government's for. It's kind of been taken to the extreme where now government's supposed to, or we expect government to provide for us. But anyways, the real purpose of government is just to act as a referee to ensure that the people's rights are protected. And the government can do that because they have the power of the state. They have, um, well, it wasn't a police force at the time, but they have some level of force. They can enforce laws. They can enact laws to circumscribe the conduct that is to be followed to respect each other's rights. Okay, so that's the first thing. So when it comes to discerning between good and evil, we need to have that freedom of choice to, learn from the good. Well, sorry, to learn the good by sometimes tasting the bitter fruit of the evil, right? Learn from our experiences. And sometimes it helps us to define the good as just making mistakes. And that's kind of baked into the plan of our salvation is making the expectation or the anticipation that we'll make bad mistakes or we'll make mistakes and we'll learn from those. And because we made the mistakes, and the consequences that come from the bad mistakes, we'll learn from that. We'll recognize that that was a bad mistake and choose a good choice. And that's kind of this idea of learning to value the good by tasting the bitter, or prizing the good by tasting the bitter, right? Um, and so we have this thing component of in making choices. We need to have that freedom to make those choices. But at the same time, the purpose of giving us that freedom to choose, and so freedom from having um, that, I guess, lack of restraints on us, is is to gear us then to be able to self-determine our lives. And so this is why I think this categorization of negative and positive freedom don't work. And I might be understanding it incorrectly, and so maybe that's why I don't think it doesn't work. But anyway, it's the way I've understood it are those two things. And so they actually reinforce each other if used correctly. Is you have the negative freedom, which is freedom from restraint, and that allows you to make the choices to then learn from the good and evil. And then at the same time, by learning from the good and evil, you start learning from the good. You start adhering to truth, and as you start applying yourself to truth, you're able to then use reality, use truth to work to the ends that you desire. And that's really what separates God from everyone else. Is He is an exalted man who understands what is good. He understands cause and effect. He knows how to then use that to achieve his ends. And that's what makes God who he is. Another component, though, to that is that this idea of restraint is really important, because if it gets to a point where, because part of being free to choose between good and evil also ties into this idea of responsibility. And we have to be responsible for our actions. We have to own up our mistakes, say, look, I made a mistake. That was wrong. Self examine ourselves, learn and identify where our weaknesses are, repent of those weaknesses, fix those, correct, adopt truthful principles, and advance forward. Now, what becomes a problem, though, is a lot of people don't want that responsibility. And instead, when they make the mistake, they blame someone else, or they rely on some other person or entity to help them. Now, the problem is when it comes to shifting our responsibility onto someone else, then in that process, we are no longer free. We avoid, when we seek to avoid responsibility for our own behavior, we are shifting that responsibility onto someone else. And we are giving that freedom or that responsibility to someone else. And so this we see as a common thing with the role of the government right now in the modern United States and much of the Western world is, um, we are now expecting the government to provide for a meaningful life. We are expecting the government to provide a happy life. And so by doing that, we're shifting the responsibility for us to learn and make right choices. We're shifting that to the government, or not even that. We're just giving up and we're just saying, hey, government, you do it. I don't care. If I make a bad choice, you're going to come in and save me. So I'll never learn from my consequence. And by doing that, then you are blunted in your ability to progress. And this is why um, the it is actually you could say a highly important issue that we understand the proper role of government. We understand the proper role even of proper child raising, even because this could even go to the extent of if a parent, and we kind of see this actually, we see in the kind of modern parental movement, um, is kind of the, well, that's maybe not right, because I guess we have soft parenting and that maybe giving too much choice to the kid. But there's other problem too where parents don't necessarily let their kids learn from the mistakes and they kind of shelter them. And so no, that actually does work because in this soft parenting kind of thing, it's almost like the kid doesn't know what choices to make, and so the parent has to be in there as a proxy. I mean, this is, I mean, there was there's recently I was reading about some instances. It's a book about called I think called Bad Parenting by Abigail Schreier, and she talks about how there were some college interviews where the parents actually came with the child, and there was orientation. That's what it was. It was the college orientation, and the parent came with the child. And so what that shows, the parent is not giving their kid the responsibility for themselves to learn. And the parents there are trying to help and prevent every little thing. And what's ended up happening is the kid is um, not self reliant. The kid is dependent upon his parent to do everything for him. And that's not freedom. That's actually captivity because what real freedom in the gospel is your ability to craft your have an outcome, have a desire, have an end goal that you want to reach, and then using your knowledge to reach that goal. That's what really wisdom is. It's your ability to identify cause and effect, and then um, use that to achieve whatever ideally whatever righteous goal. I don't know if a wise person could be wicked. I don't think that's possible because to be wise requires you to understand truth. So a wise person will always, whatever goal they have, will be righteous, and they know how to achieve that because they understand laws of cause and effect. They understand what are good choices, and then they implement those to bring that about. And so, um, when it comes to God making us free, the key thing is to understand that God's going to give us space to make mistakes. And sometimes, I've had challenges in the past wondering where God is in the midst of my suffering, and I cry out to Him sometimes, and I feel like He's not there, and it can be kind of shattering, and it can cause people to doubt. But there's also that element that if God immediately intervenes in every little thing, then we never learn for ourselves how to work through that trial. And now I look back and I realized that it was a blessing because I learned that I had, through God's grace, and through praying and seeking distillation of revelation to guide me along the way, that I could get through that trial without having to be completely relieved of it. And by doing so, I now have more freedom. I have more ability to act and not be acted upon. I have more ability to understand how cause and effects works. I learned more about dedication, and I learned a lot of things along the way that if God just stepped in and removed me from that, then I wouldn't have learned that. And I would then be reliant on God or dependent upon God for every little thing. And now we have to be dependent on God, certainly. And I'm not saying that we don't, but there is that fine line to be, because God even chastises people for being slothful, right? To wait upon God. God also says, our Lord says in Doctrine and Covenants, it's not meet that a man should be commanded in all things. Why? Because we should use our own reason to bring good to pass, because that's what God does. And that's what those who follow God do, is they don't have to be told every little thing to do. They know what to do because they know what's good, and they can just see it for themselves, and they just act. And by doing so, they're free because they're freely choosing to do that. They're not being told, oh, you need to do that, you need to do that. Now, sometimes, again, that happens because they don't know and there's something they're missing, or it needs to go to God's plan. And so God will, of course, point them the way. But what ultimately is to happen, and what we should really strive for, is to be able to, um, I don't want to say handle things on our own because we always need God, but to embrace that period of helplessness a little bit, because then that's that space where we can improve and grow. That's a space where we can figure out what we're doing wrong. We can self evaluate. We can get rid of bad beliefs, false beliefs, should I say, things that are holding us down, adopt good beliefs. We can go to God in prayer and use that time to build a relationship with Him. And then we acquire those things so that we can then be actual agents. Because there's that whole difference between being agents or objects, things acted upon, and those that are evil, those that are of the devil, are those who are acted upon. They wait for things to happen. And that's not how God is. God never just waited, said, well, I'm going to, you know, make the world when I feel like it or when someone tells me to, or something like that. No, he saw that there was chaos, and he being good, he knowing cause and effect, he know having to bring about the good, just ordered that chaos into a world, and then put us on it, and is now guiding us along the way to be like him. And so that's what God's doing all along. And so if you feel that God has abandoned you, I mean, first see if you first abandon him, because sometimes the Lord is slow to hear the prayers of the wicked. And so maybe there's a lot of repentance you need to do. But if you feel that you've been on the right way, and God's just abandoned you, well, it could be a time for growth, a time to um, learn from making mistakes and having to kind of wrestle with that absence of God perfectly directing you, and so you can grow. And one more example is with parents, right? Um, Eventually, a baby, you bring a baby, and the baby is completely relying on you 100%. But by doing so, the baby can't do anything but what you tell the baby to do, or show the baby, or guide the baby to do, right? um, and if a parent never teaches the child to crawl or walk or do things on their own, then they're going to be completely dependent upon the parent. And when that happens, they no longer are free agents, but they are being acted upon because they're being guided and directed by the parent. But that's not what it's about. It's about us learning how to walk on our own. And so the proper parent's going to eventually give enough um, freedom, enough space for the kid to learn and make mistakes on their own, so that they can then start becoming agents by identifying cause and effect, and by learning for themselves, and then therefore growing into being free agents. So that's what God offers us. And Satan is trying to do the exact opposite. He wants us to be dependent upon him. He wants us to be dependent on other people. He wants us to shift responsibility so that we are then objects that are not free. And that's what the captivity of the devil is that Satan captivates us by taking away our agency, by taking away our ability to distinguish between good and evil, and taking away our ability to bring about good. And then we just have to rely on him. And that's how he traps us, because then he has all the knowledge, or he has knowledge and we don't, and we're susceptible to his will. So those are things to kind of consider, and realize that um, God is the one who makes us free. And it's sometimes freedom happens in ways, in a process that might seem counterintuitive, but God knows what he's doing.